Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new Nancy Drew analysis video. Today's video is brought to you by the patrons over at Mystique Manor and by all the official fellow detective channel members. If you too would like to support the channel and gain access to exclusive features, check out patreon.com/wizardkitten to become a patron, or click join next to the subscribe button to become an official fellow detective. Arguably, the most exciting part of any mystery is discovering the identity of the culprit. After spending an entire case uncovering clues, interrogating suspects, and piecing together information, finally realizing who was behind the crime and why can feel so satisfying, if it is done well. From this point on, I will be discussing culprits, culprit motivations, and plot spoilers from throughout the Nancy Drew series. If you don't want to hear any culprit information, then proceed with caution. You have been warned. Now, onward. In the Nancy Drew series specifically, the majority of the culprits follow a conventional pattern. They are one of the physical, interactable suspects, not a phone friend, and they are revealed at the end of the game or very near the end. Usually the crime has been committed before Nancy arrives on the scene, or the crimes are ongoing when she arrives and she discovers them in the process. It then becomes Nancy's job to discover who is behind the wrongdoing. These wrongdoings vary massively in magnitude, from theft or deception all the way to attempted and successful murder. Knowing this information when we start the game, many fellow detectives will attempt to guess the culprit before the end of the game. For example, when a player first begins Treasure in the Royal Tower and meets the four physical characters, Dexter Egan, Lisa Ostrom, Jacques Brunet, and Beatrice Hotchkiss, the player might try to decide which of those characters is the culprit before it is officially revealed. But fellow detectives might sometimes be bamboozled, because while the majority of Nancy Drew culprits follow this conventional pattern, there are several unconventional culprits that break the mold. So without further ado, let's discuss all the unconventional culprits in the Nancy Drew series. Of the 34 games, about 1/3, 11 total, have an unconventional culprit. I'm going to rank these from my least favorite type to my most favorite type. Let's start from the beginning with my least favorite unconventional culprit type, the repeater. This culprit is unconventional because it involves a previous culprit returning in a later game as a culprit once again. This has only happened once in the Nancy Drew series, when Dwayne Powers from Stay Tuned for Danger returned in disguise as Johnny Roll to be the culprit in Ransom of the Seven Ships. In theory, this is a cool idea. Theoretically, we should all gasp in shock and awe at the reveal of Dwayne Powers as Bess's kidnapper. But this type of unconventional culprit falls prey to way too many logistical issues. For one thing, I didn't gasp in shock and awe when Dwayne Powers was revealed as the culprit. I said, huh? Because I hadn't played Stay Tuned for Danger before Ransom of the Seven Ships, and therefore had no clue who Dwayne Powers even was. Not only did this make the culprit fall flat in Ransom of the Seven Ships, but it also kind of ruined the culprit for me in Stay Tuned for Danger when I did eventually play it. This is a major issue with this culprit type, because you can't guarantee that players will know the culprit from their previous game. Additionally, the design of the character and the voice actor of the character changed from Stay Tuned for Danger to Ransom of the Seven Ships, so even if I had played the game, Dwayne was basically unrecognizable. Furthermore, this kind of culprit just feels a little bit lazy. Rather than putting in the work to develop a new character, we get a recycled version of someone from before. I get asked a lot what culprits I would love to see return in the series, and my honest answer is none. This game is a really good example of why returning culprits just don't work, in my opinion. Next, the multiples. This culprit is unconventional because instead of just one person, the culprit is two or more suspects. This is the most common unconventional culprit in the Nancy Drew series, occurring in 4 games. In Creature of Kapu Cave, Big Island Mike Mapu and his daughter, Pua Mapu, are responsible for destroying the pineapple crops and unintentionally creating a boom of the fritillated flag beetles in an effort to steal the Healy Healy Research Center land and pay off loan sharks. In Tomb of the Lost Queen, Abdullah Bakum more or less blackmails Lily Crew to assist him in his evil plan to steal from Nefertari's tomb and sell antiquities on the black market. In Labyrinth of Lies, literally all the suspects are involved in an elaborate scheme to steal and sell Greek artifacts from the museum. And finally, in Mystery of the Seven Keys, Vladena Zlati and Elka Strojnik are in cahoots to steal the crown jewels and frame Residente. If you're familiar with my game rankings, then you know that all these games are in my bottom half and 3 of them are in my bottom 5. It probably doesn't come as much of a surprise then that I'm not a fan of this unconventional culprit style. I understand the theory of having more than one culprit in that it is unpredictable, but it frankly just feels like a cop-out to me most of the time. Rather than cleverly writing why one suspect is the culprit and the others are not, it sort of feels just like throwing everything at the wall. Why give suspects different motives if they're all going to be guilty? Maybe if it was done well, I'd like it better, but otherwise, this culprit type just doesn't work for me. Next up, the boss. This culprit is unconventional because it's the person who hired us for the case and to whom we report. Normally, this person is a phone friend and therefore can't really be a culprit because then there wouldn't be an exciting culprit confrontation. But in 2 Nancy Drew games, Secrets Can Kill Remastered and The Deadly Device, the person who hired us to solve the mystery was the culprit. Detective Beach in Secrets Can Kill Remastered is actually the one who killed Jake Rogers, but he hired Nancy, an unknown teenage detective, to find Jake's journal and assist in solving the case. Turns out, though, that the journal was actually his and implicated him in Jake's murder. He needed someone to find it, hence hiring Nancy. He didn't expect her to put the pieces together so effectively. Similarly, Victor Lossett hires us to solve the mystery of Nico Jovic's murder because Nancy's reference, Deirdre Shannon, seriously undersold her skills. Victor specifically hired Nancy because he thought she would fail and implicate Ryan instead of him because it turns out Victor was the culprit all along. This culprit really stood out as a red flag to me when I first started playing because he started as a phone friend with a physical model during a FaceTime-esque call. That has never happened before or since in the series, which personally immediately raised my hackles. This unconventional culprit type is certainly interesting. Logically, one would assume that someone who hires you to solve a mystery actually wants it to be solved. However, as this culprit type proves, you can't always trust that to be the case. Indeed, there are many other mysteries where Nancy questions the person who hired her or the person she reports to, suspicious that perhaps their intentions are not pure. It's a fun culprit type because it turns the case on its head, but it also tends to be fairly easy to catch and difficult to hide. As a result, this one is kinda just fine in my book. It's a little too obvious, but it's at least more of a surprise. Next up, the spontaneous culprit. This culprit is unconventional because they aren't a culprit to begin with, but rather become a culprit on a whim. This only happens once in the series in Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon. Nancy is hired by Laurie Gerard to find Jake Hurley's treasure, which she successfully does. No crime was committed and everything seems fine, until Laurie spontaneously decides to attempt murder. Whoops! Laurie decides that she wants all the credit for finding the treasure, but she isn't certain that Nancy will let her, so she decides to trap Nancy in Jake's mine, apparently for all eternity. Not cool, Laurie. This game and culprit situation is interesting because up until the very end, we don't have a culprit to try and uncover. Detectives spend the whole case just trying to solve a historical mystery, but Laurie still counts as the game's culprit because of the confrontation at the end. This is a little more surprising and fun than the plain old boss culprit, but still feels a little loosey-goosey. Next up, the child culprit. This culprit is unconventional because we typically wouldn't expect a child to be capable of purposefully committing a heinous crime. But Jane Penvellyn in Curse of Blackmore Manor is special. Children are incredibly rare in the Nancy Drew series. We only have 3 of them, and so one of them being a culprit creates a fascinating ratio. Anyway, Jane Penvellyn is responsible for making Linda Penvellyn think she's turning into a werewolf. Jane is also the one in search of the Penvellyn treasure. I enjoy this unconventional culprit type because the culprit still has to have a motive, means, and opportunity, but children are inherently less suspicious because we underestimate their capabilities. This makes it all the more surprising when they are actually the culprit. We almost see the same phenomenon in The Captive Curse, where it looks, for the briefest moment, like Lucas might be the culprit when we catch him dressed as the monster. Personally, I think this was a clever twist on the part of the Her Interactive writers, because players may be less likely to write Lucas off if they've played Curse of Blackmore Manor and know what children in Nancy's universe are capable of. Overall, I'm a fan of this unconventional culprit, and now very suspicious of children in the Nancy Drew games. Next up, the belated culprit. This culprit is unconventional because the crime for which they are responsible happened in the past and was in fact not the crime that Nancy was hired to solve. This happens once in the series in Ghost of Thornton Hall, where Nancy was hired to solve the mystery of Jessalyn Thornton's disappearance. By the end of the mystery, we discover that Jessalyn went missing of her own accord, so she wasn't actually kidnapped as we were led to believe. However, by the end of the game, we've uncovered a new historical mystery. Who killed Charlotte Thornton? By finding Jessalyn, we learned that Clara Thornton was responsible for Charlotte's death, and from that point on, Clara is treated as the culprit of the game. I like this unconventional culprit because the twists all still make sense. By solving one mystery, we also uncover and solve another mystery. The surprise element still works, and we still get the satisfaction of bringing a culprit to justice. And finally, my favorite unconventional culprit, the innocent culprit. This also only happens once in the Nancy Drew series, which, side note, is a good thing. These unconventional culprits only stay unconventional if they happen once or twice. Regardless, the innocent culprit is unconventional because, while they did commit the crime, their intentions were not malicious and their story isn't framed as one of evil wrongdoing. I am of course referring to Fiona Malloy in Haunting of Castle Malloy. Fiona did, in fact, kidnap Matt Simmons and keep him hostage, but the game makes this clear that this ended up being more accidental than purposeful. Matt got himself stuck by messing with a secret passageway in the nursery at the castle and wandering through tunnels until he got trapped by the old lab. Fiona discovered Matt was there and fed him vegetables. Dibs on the potatoes. Though she didn't trap him herself, Fiona also didn't help Matt leave, and according to him, treated him more like a pet than anything else. But the game is sympathetic to Fiona because she's had a really rough go of things. We learn both directly and indirectly that Fiona was orphaned when her parents died of an explosion in the castle. She wandered the moors alone and was taken in by an old woman, a hermit who lived in the bog hut. The game alludes to the hermit being extremely socially isolated and unaware of how to raise children, which may have resulted in neglect and abuse towards Fiona. When the woman died, Fiona continued to live isolated in the bog hut for decades, subsisting on the land and befriending crows. Lonely, confused, and deeply traumatized, the game explains that Fiona didn't intentionally cause any harm. This lends a unique depth to the Haunting of Castle Malloy and makes the culprit situation extremely interesting, which, of course, makes it my favorite. So those are all the unconventional culprits in the Nancy Drew series. Some have their merits, while others feel less like clever writing and more of a cop-out. In general, I would say I prefer the conventional culprit system of the Nancy Drew games. It keeps the playing field more fair and therefore makes it more difficult to accurately guess the real culprit. Many of the best games in the series with the most intricate plots have a relatively mundane criminal at the end, but it's the lead-up, the obfuscation, and the subterfuge that make them so exciting. But what do you think, fellow detectives? I'd love to hear what you think about conventional versus unconventional culprits in the series. Do you prefer a conventional culprit, or do you like when things get more creative? Of the unconventional culprit types, which is your favorite, and which just doesn't work for you? Are there any other unconventional culprit types you'd like to see in future games? Let a Wizard Kitten know in the comments section down below. If you really enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button or tipping me for the video with a super thanks next to the download button right beneath the video. If you would like to come join a fantastic group of fellow detectives at Mystique Manor as a patron for the channel, gain access to exclusive content, and support the making of more content like this, please check out patreon.com/wizardkitten. I also have channel memberships with exclusive badges and emojis to use during streams and in the comment section. If you'd like to support the channel by becoming an official fellow detective, click join next to the subscribe button. Please feel free to follow the channel on Instagram or Discord, linked in the description box down below. And as always, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Cozy Game content. Thank you so much for watching, fellow detectives. I will see you soon.